Welcome to Calculations, a talk show. I'm Gary Johnson. We have a special guest today, Robert Whiting. I call him a historian of African-American history. I'll see what he has to say, but as far as I know, when I want to learn something about African-American history or ancient Egyptian history, this is the man that I call. Welcome to the show, Robert Whiting. How are you?
Thank you, Gary. I'm really honored to be able to spend some time with you and talk about our amazing history. And it's so amazing that it really can be unbelievable for some folk, because we have been programmed and taught that we didn't really have a major role in ancient history and shaping and forming what we call modern civilization in the world today.
So why is it, in your view, why is it important for us, the community, and maybe everybody, you can define us, but why is it important for us to know about African people and their contributions to society?
Well, I think it's critical because for a number of reasons. For example, once we begin to understand our history and knowledge of ourselves and contributions, it changes our time frame in terms of how we view the world. For example, oftentimes in the schools, the colleges, and the universities, our time range is the 500-year of our enslavement, all right? And in a way, it was a Holocaust because it basically destroyed us as a people. It destroyed our memories. It destroyed our cultural norms. It destroyed what our ancestors had learned and passed on from generation to generation. And it also destroyed how we looked at ourselves. So our 200,000 year time frame has been replaced by either a 500-year time frame or a 2,000-year time frame. So that drastically changes not only how we view the world, how we view Africa, but how we view ourselves. And in addition to that, it puts us in a position where we really don't know what time of day it is at the present time, because it's literally impossible to understand exactly where we are today if we don't understand where we were and what we've accomplished and what we've been able to do to bring civilization and science to the world. So that's one of the reasons why we are able to manufacture people like some of the right-wing conservatives who basically agree with all of the oppression that is being done to us. They agree and in fact vote for that oppression, even though it impacts their relatives and people who look like them. So it's extremely critical. Also, we basically have trouble distinguishing between the truth and the untruth. For example, if someone says that, well, Africa is the dark continent and it was in darkness until other ethnic groups came and brought light, then if I don't understand the history of Africa and the greatness of what was achieved there and the accomplishments, then I'm more likely to believe that story. And that's the situation we're in terms of matriculating through the school systems and the colleges and universities. If we're taught anything, we are confined within that slave window, which basically, when you look at the calculation, we're talking about 500 years and we're talking about maybe over 240, 50,000 years of history, that 500-year window equals to about 0.002% of our history. That's basically all we're taught. So there's it's no mystery as to why we have issues with coming together, with being able to move lockstep in concert with one another without having a meeting, without having to discuss anything openly, like other ethnic groups. Okay, and we can see that in Washington, D.C., Gary, where you can have the Ethiopians, the Eritreans, and folk from that part of Africa come to America, and because they have a language, a culture, and customs, they can come together, pool their resources, and that's why when you go to a place, for example, like Silver Spring, Maryland, you have all of these immigrants, these African immigrants with most of the businesses.
I never put it together like that, but as I'm listening to you, I'm also trying to fast forward as to our self-esteem as a community.
Oh,
go ahead, say something about that.
Oh gracious. Let me give you an example. For a young person who, or anyone for that matter, and that's black or white, has nothing to do with color, if they're taught that Africans were the first modern humans on the planet, okay, and that Africans were the ones who were able to, through the observation of nature, because nature was the book, as I indicated, and over thousands and thousands of years began to notice certain patterns such as the moon, and they were able to replicate that in some of their stories. And then we found the Ishango bone, which basically has advanced mathematics where they were able to figure out decimals. They were able to figure out duality, how important duality was. They were able to figure out prime numbers on that Ishango bone. They had prime numbers from 1 through 20. And a prime number is any number that can be divided by itself in 1. So those are advanced mathematic concepts that we were able to figure out by studying nature. The first female physician was an African woman, okay? And she was over top of training the women to become doctors, all right? How would that impact our young lady? The first man who was able to harness medical information was Imhotep. He was the first physician in the world. So the first physicians in the world were Africans, all right? How would that play into our young folks' mindset if they were to decide that they wanted to be a doctor, but yet they had to struggle because the curriculum is tough. They had to study a lot of mathematics and science, chemistry, etc. It's a lot easier if they know that this is something that has carried through from ancient times all the way up to the present time, and then becoming a doctor is nothing new because they were the first doctors.
Now, these are things that are not in dispute, correct? These are facts.
Oh, these are facts, documented facts. We had the names, we had the medical papyri, we had the mathematical papyri. We had the proof is overwhelming. It's just not taught.
Right. Wow. Wow. So, based on what I'm hearing also, can you explain how Africans along the Nile laid the foundation for civilization?
Okay. As I indicated earlier, nature was the book. So over time, they began to realize that there were certain patterns. And in ancient Africa, for example, on the Nile River, the Nile would overflow every year. So they had to find ways to know when the Nile was about to overflow. So one of the ways was when the sun and Sirius came up together, which is the what we call the summer solstice. And when that happened, about 20 days later, the Nile would overflow. So they took a special interest in this rising of the sun with the constellation of Sirius. All right. And so once they saw that, they started preparing for the flooding of the land. And that was an early indicator of the Nile overflowing. And that was the lifeblood, because if they weren't able to know when that was going to happen, people would die, and they wouldn't be able to prepare and move the people to certain locations or stop farming. So it was critical for their life for them to be able to understand that. Another thing that they noticed was that during the spring equinox, when you had equal day and equal night, that a constellation would come up on the horizon, and it would stay there for about 2,160 years. Then it would change. All right. So these were patterns. Then they started looking at what they call the imperishables, which are basically the polar stars, which circumvent Polaris. And they figured out over time that that was a 25,890 year cycle. And then once they put all of that together, they were able to develop a calendar, a 360-day calendar that reconciled with the solar year, the 365 and a quarter day every 1,460 years. Okay. And the way that happened was that every summer solstice, when the sun and Sirius would come up together, by the way, Sirius is one of the brightest stars in the heaven, they noticed that every 4 years, it would come up a day late. So if the new year was on, say, for example, June the 21st, 4 years later, it would be June the 20th. Okay. I'm sorry, June the 22nd. I'm sorry. And so then 4 years after that, it would be June the 23rd. So every 4 years. So they were able to figure out that if they looked at that cycle, that it would take 1,460 years for that to make a complete circle to come back to the beginning of the new year. So this knowledge was embedded in their spirituality and was critical for their survival on the Nile River.
Can you help me understand Kemet?
Okay. Yes. I can help you understand it, but I have to utilize the African names.
Okay.
One of the things that has happened in Africa is that whenever other people would come, they would change the names. And so what happens is when people started coming in, it was initially, the Africans called it Kemet, or Kemet Nu, which Kemet is represented by Chaco. Kemet in the Medu Neter, which was the language that was renamed the hieroglyphs, meant black, Chaco. Kemet Nu means the land of the black people. Now, if you go on Google or go out and do a search, you will see that the name Kemet will come up, but they say that the reason it was called black was because of the black soil on the Nile. That's why they called the country and named it after the color black, which is nonsense because there's no people in the history of the world who would name their country after some black mud. People usually name their country after themselves. So that's one example. So it's important to use the African names because the African names will tell you what the people had in mind and it's part of their culture. Another example would be the Medu Neter, which is what they call their writing. Now, when you translate the Medu Neter, it means words of gods or God's words. But when that concept is changed to hieroglyphs, hieroglyphs means something is just written in glyphs. Okay, it loses the historical tie to Africans and their culture. It's the same thing with the Washington Monument, which we call the obelisk. An obelisk is just something that is basically square and it has a pyramid dome at the top. That's what it means. But when you look at the African name, it ties it back to a very important story regarding what transpired in Africa in terms of them coming up with certain concepts. So again, we have to be very careful whenever we are talking about ancient Africa and using the names and the terminology that invaders use, because you lose the historical and the cultural meanings of that particular artifact if you don't stick with the African names.
If these things aren't taught, and you've already established that I went to school and college and I didn't learn any of this like that. And I went to Black schools, in public education. What is the risk of us, or I guess the increased risk of us, the impact of not knowing our history?
Oh, it's major. What it does is it impacts our view of the world. It impacts our view of ourselves. It impacts our view of others. And what do I mean by that? Is it would be almost impossible for someone who understood the history of Africa to call himself or anyone else the N-word. It would be impossible for someone who understood their history as an African or as an African American to think that somehow that we are at the bottom in most categories of well-being because somehow we don't have what it takes like other ethnic groups. It also impacts how we look at ourselves and how we deal with each other, and also how we perceive our potentiality as humans. So when we have a lack of knowledge of self, it impacts every aspect of our lives, and it doesn't matter how smart we are or how many degrees we have. Because without that foundation, we are viewing the world through a false reality. Okay? And that false reality is based on what our former slave masters and our oppressors taught us to believe because it keeps us locked down with mental chains around our mind, and we don't even understand it. And that's what's so dangerous about when you are mentally enslaved. The individual doesn't realize that they are mentally enslaved. Okay, so and that mental enslavement causes us to have very low interest in Africa. I mean, I've done lectures over 30 or 40 years, and oftentimes I ask the audience, when you took your first trip abroad, where did you go? France, Germany, England, you know, I mean, all over the globe. Very few people will say Africa. Okay, and when you think about that, when you think about people from various ethnicities, usually if they're going to take their first trip abroad, they're most likely to go to the place of their ancestors or their origin. Right. And so we are one of the few ethnic groups in the world that when we take our a trip abroad, we don't even think about from whence we came. So
that's so impactful. And I'm just thinking, I wonder how you feel. I'm just going to put it in a question form. How do you feel when you hear some of the music by Black artists, musicians, rappers, or see some of the images that are negative, that are being applauded by our community and mainstream media for some dollars? I mean, without maybe even knowing the impact.
I understand it. It's part of this confusion and the fact that they don't really have a positive view and knowledge of themselves. So it allows them to denigrate themselves, disrespect their women, disrespect others. And it's almost as if a lot of people have lost their way because they don't have knowledge of themselves. And see, when we look at the position that most of us are in, think about this. You'll say, we are still sort of like in a mental enslavement mode. And I'm going to ask 5 questions, and you don't even have to respond because you know what the answer is. Whose food do you eat? Whose clothes do you wear? Whose language do you speak? Who do you work for? And lastly, whose God do you worship? You can always tell a conquered people because they worship a God that doesn't look like them.
Wow. Yeah, the impact on us, it's the phrase cultural conditioning keeps coming back to my mind. We've been culturally conditioned to believe certain things, to think certain things. And over time, when these things go unchallenged, they just seem normal.
Yes.
Wow.
They become normal. And because we don't have a historical perspective, when people say that we are criminals, we're like, well, we are criminals? What happened when Columbus and his crew and the conquistadors stumbled up on America? There's a very good book about that Holocaust. It's called American Holocaust, by the way. And there's another one called 1491, the year before Columbus. And these scholars estimate that close to 100 million natives of the Americas, including the islands, were wiped out the face of the earth. And some of the things that were done were just horrifying, such as on the island of Hispaniola, where they just wiped out the entire population within a couple of decades. And what they would do is, it's just horrific. cut babies out of the women's stomach and slam them against a tree or throw them in the water. I mean, it was just horrific. So, and then when we come and see what was done to us, and then people call us criminals and say that we're the criminals in America. But if you look at the history, we could start killing people, thousands of people every day, and not catch up with some of these other ethnic groups that have slaughtered people all over the planet. But see, because we don't understand this and we're not taught the history, we fall for these traps. And some of us, some Black people actually think that we are the criminals because we go out there and we're killing one another. Yeah, why do we kill one another? That's part of this self-hatred. That's part of this ignorance. That's part of this confusion, okay? And then not only that, nobody talks about white on white violence. Look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. What was World War II? What was World War I? I mean, so what did the conquistadors do? Okay. So when you're talking about criminality, trying to assign that to Black people or ethnic group is an effort that is fraught with errors and misinformation. And the way people are able to get away with it is because we don't really understand history going all the way back to the beginning of time. Because once we start looking at African history, then we have to learn everyone else's history because Africans were here first. Okay, and they were on the planet about 140,000 years before they even started leaving Africa. And there were no other modern humans. I'm not talking about pre-humans like Neanderthals. Okay, I'm talking about modern humans like us. There were no other humans on the planet for about the first 140,000 years until Africans started leaving Africa. And once they started leaving Africa, voila, about 10 to 20,000 years later, Asians surfaced, Indonesians surfaced, Indians surfaced, and Europeans surfaced. But all of them basically were the result of Africans going to these different locations, and because of ultraviolet light and the last ice age, they had to adapt over hundreds of thousands of years to the changing climate. And so naturally, if the sun doesn't come out that often and it's starting to get colder, you can't survive with dark skin, because when the sun does come out, you need to absorb as much sunlight as possible, because if the body doesn't, it will get rickets and the humans can't survive. So the body naturally just started eliminating the melanin so that it could survive with little sunlight. And that's how we got our humans that we call Europeans. When we went up into what we call Asia, we had to lighten up because it was getting colder there too, but also we had to have the folds over the eyes because of the sunlight from the mountains and the snow. So nature over time developed natural sunshades.
Wow. Wow. So how can someone watching, listening to you, what can they do within their sphere of control and influence to make a difference, to educate themselves or others?
Well, I tell you, normally I would say start reading certain books. But right now, because of the technology, one of the best ways is to go to YouTube and just type in ancient African history or Kemetic history. And there are excellent videos that will walk people through the history. Now, in saying that, there's nothing like reading, because what reading does is And I saw this over one of the temples when I was in Kemet, or what we now call Egypt. It was over the top of a library in one of the temples. And it stated, reading is the feeding of the five senses. So when one starts reading, it manifests itself in your changing of your perspective. It impacts every one of your five senses, your sense of smell, your sense of touch, what you see, every aspect starts changing. So my normal recommendation is, in fact, I have a list here. I don't know if you can see it, but this is the list right here of some of the books that I recommend that people read. And for example, General History of Africa 2 by the United Nations Education and Scientific Culture Organization. This is extremely important because this whole debate about whether or not the Egyptians were Africans or from outer space or from God knows where was settled in 1974 at a Cairo symposium. Two brilliant scholars, Dr. Theophile Obenga and Dr. Sheikh Diop, attended that conference. Now, these Egyptologists were given 2 years to prepare for this conference. So they had, since 1972, they had 2 years to prepare and get ready for this conference where they were going to settle once and for all who were the ancient commissions. All right. And they showed up. And when it was all said and done, at the end of that report, it said that because Doctors Diop and Dr. Obenga were so well prepared that the evidence and information they provided was so overwhelming that these other 16 world-renowned Egyptologists just couldn't contribute. Okay. Wow. Everybody should know that. So if anybody comes up to you and say, well, the ancient Egyptians, they weren't Black, they come from wherever, it's nonsense. It was settled in 1974 by Doctors Obenga and Doctors Joe.
Wow. You know, in the time that we have left, what is important for us to know? Because I know you have a program that's coming up. So I want you to talk about that, but also just leave us with something that because you've left us a lot, I'm going to have to, really process all this because you're submarine deep when it comes to this, which is good, But I know your program is coming up, and is there anything else that we should be knowing or thinking about? Because you've given us some good direction with Google and doing some research. Is there anything else?
Yes, I think there's one thing that everyone should know, that the Greeks went to Africa for their education, starting with Thales, the first Greek philosopher. All right, and he stayed there until, according to the Greek writings, until he was elderly. And so he was the first Greek philosopher. Pythagoras spent 22 years studying in Africa, and he never took credit for the properties of the right triangle. And the properties of the right triangle were embedded in the step pyramid of Saqqara, which is the first stone complex built in the world, the first one in the world, thousands of years before Pythagoras was even born. All right. So I think that it's critical for us to kind of understand some of those things, because those of us who call ourselves Black Greeks at some point need to go back and reassess that designation and think about the fact that the Greeks went to Africa for their education. Now, that leads me to one of the things that we're doing here in Palm Coast at the African American Culture Center. we're going to celebrate the African New Year because I indicated that the Africans were the first humans on the planet to figure out the 365 and a quarter day year, which is the solar year. And we're going to celebrate that on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, on June the 21st. We're going to have a sunrise service starting at 6 a.m. on Jungle Hut Road Park Beach. And we're going to have a whole ceremony to just look at that phenomenon of the sun and Sirius coming up simultaneously. And we're sending prayers out that it doesn't rain.
Yeah.
Okay. Or if it's really cloudy, we won't be able to see it. But we have a whole, about a 40-minute program scheduled at Jungle Hut Road Park Beach, which is right across the bridge. All you do is just go down Palm Coast Parkway, go across the bridge, keep going, and you'll see Jungle Hut Road Beach at the corner, make a right, and you're there at that beach. Then we're going to have a ceremony at AACS from 10 to 12. And I would encourage all of the listeners to try to make that, because we're finding out, and I didn't know this when I first came up with this idea to celebrate our New Year. And I thought that we could go out as a committee and find the best of what other people had done and then develop a program.
Right.
Well, to my utter amazement and surprise, we couldn't find anyone else who had really celebrated the African New Year. We've had top scholars to talk about it and to mention it.
Right.
But we haven't had anyone to take the effort and the time to really celebrate that significant contribution to the world, because the entire world operates on African time, and that is the solar year.
Wow. All right, once again, Robert Whiting. He is my personal historian when I want to learn something about ancient African or Egyptian history. I thank you very much for coming on the show. Good luck with your program, and we'll have to have you back and see how things go, because I know this is going to generate more questions.
Okay, great. And I'll be happy to respond to questions if people send you questions or have additional questions that they may want to explore or ask. I'll be more than willing to assist in providing information.
Yeah, we're going to have this interview embedded on blackmeninamerica.com and also on our Calculations Talk Show website, and also on our social media platforms, which include Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And if you're listening in your car, you can listen and watch on Spotify. So you're going to be all over. So thank you, Robert Whiting.
And thank you, Brother Gary. I really appreciate you honoring me with this interview.
All righty.